Vasudevasutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishna Vande Jagadgurum. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to our class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna, class 51. We have the ambitious task today of completing chapter 6 today. May not be possible, and let's not rush it too much, but I would like to if possible, which means we would have to cover verses 37 to 47 of the Gita. We will go through many of them swiftly and then focus on the verses that were the focus of the study questions for this time, which some of you answered, both online and in person, so thank you for your responses. We'll talk about some of them as well. So with the focus on Shabda Brahma in verse 44 and then verses 46 to 47. Okay, so that's one thing. Heads up on the next two classes. I'm going to South Africa on Wednesday night, coming back on August 14th, I believe. So our next two Gita classes will be toward the end of August. Sunday, August 24th will be the next class, 9:30 a.m. And here's the assignment. The thing is, assuming we complete chapter 6 today, and even if we don't, this is still the assignment. We read finally the next chapter of Essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo's Essay on the Gita, which we have put on pause for a long time because he covered the whole chapter 6 in one brief chapter. And the chapter is called The Gist of the Karmayoga. It's the next chapter following the one on chapter 6. The Gist of the Karmayoga, pages 247 to 258, about 11 pages. And basically what he does there is he summarizes the whole first 6 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita and then explains how the first 6 chapters of the Gita relate to the rest of the Gita, the remaining 12 chapters of the Gita. So he's kind of doing this much more holistic, high-altitude, bird's-eye view kind of discussion of the Gita. Very helpful and interesting. We'll be focusing on that in our next class, that chapter, and discussing that. Okay. And we'll clean up some loose ends if we haven't covered everything today on chapter 6. Okay. And then the second class in August is the next week, which is Sunday, August 31st. And please pay attention here because it's a little bit confusing. We're going to start tackling chapter 7 of the Gita starting the August 31st class, okay? And so the assignment is to read verses 1 through 14 of chapter 7 of the Gita, okay? Along with his chapter on chapter 7, those verses from chapter 7, and it's called The Two Natures from Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita, and it's pages 263 to 277. And there are study questions based on that chapter on chapter 7 of the Gita. I'm giving you a full month to work on those so that I'm giving you a heads up. So the study questions are not for the next class, but for the next class, August 31st, Sunday. The study question, but I'm going to release them, immediately so that you can work on them, get a head start on you can just read the chapter ahead of time and then work on the study questions. Okay, so that's the plan. Now, let us begin with verse 37 of the Gita. So please repeat after me. Arjuna uvacha.
Arjuna uvacha.
Means Arjuna said, of course. And after this whole discourse, 36 verses on high-level meditation techniques, Arjuna gets a little frightened and freaked out. So what does he ask? He's ayatihi Shraddhaya upeto yogat chalita manasaha aprapya yoga samsiddhim kam gatim Krishna gacchati. I'm going to read the next two verses with it. It's a 3-part question or 3-verse question. Kachit Ubhaya vibhrashtash. Yeah, anyway, don't worry about it. Chinnabram Iva nashyati Apratishto Mahabaho Vimudho Brahmana Pati Etanme Samshayam Krishna Chetum Arhasi
arhasi
asheshatah
asheshatah
tvodanyah
tvodanyah
samshayasyasya
samshayasyasya
cheta
cheta
nahi
nahi
upapadyate.
upapadyate.
All right, so this is a three-part question. Let's go through them quickly. Okay. So the ayatihi, the person who is not particularly adept in yoga, okay, and doesn't have all that much self-control, but on the positive side is shraddhaya upetaha, has faith, shraddha, he has faith, shraddha. Yoga chalita manasaha, and whose mind is actually not firmly rooted in yoga. Aprapya yoga samsiddhim, that person obviously has not attained the perfection in yoga, right? He has not attained the heights of yoga. Aprapya means not having attained the yoga samsiddhi, perfection in yoga. Kam gatim Krishna gacchati. What happens to this person? The person who has faith on the positive side, faith in the teachings of the scriptures, faith in Guru, faith in God, but doesn't have self-control and is not able to make much progress in yoga. That's the question. And then he kind of, the next two verses which we read, follow up on that. It's very poetic. Next verse, 38. Does he not sort of fall between the cracks, is Arjuna's question. Ubhaya vibhrashya. Because he's a spiritual aspirant, he's given up a lot of the pleasures of the world. And at the same time, he's not able to make all that much appreciable progress in the path of yoga. So it kind of sucks to be him, sort of the situation is Arjuna's concern here. And he's speaking for every man, every woman and man. So the two terms in Sanskrit are bhoga and yoga. So you've renounced the bhoga, and yet you're not getting much on the yoga side either. And so you're kind of, where are you exactly? No man's land, basically. And so he uses this beautiful metaphor. Does this person, this unfortunate fellow, fall from both bhoga and yoga and die like a dissolving cloud? Perish like a dissolving cloud. This is a beautiful metaphor used. Like a cloud disperses or breaks up. And there's no substance in it in the end. So this is the concern. What the heck happens to me if I'm not able to attain perfection in this and yet I've given up the pleasures of the world? What happens? And he says in 39, Etan me samsham. So this is the doubt that's eating me up inside, O Krishna. And I know that you alone are going to be able to answer this doubt. So I was just thinking in the context of our tradition, the Ramakrishna tradition, who might be somebody who is like this. And you can come up with your own example, but I was thinking of somebody like Mothur Babu, the extremely wealthy patron of Sri Ramakrishna, who had more faith than he did in Sri Ramakrishna. It's extraordinary. And he recognized Sri Ramakrishna's spiritual greatness and his divine status way before Keshav Shan and all these other guys who made him famous and all that, and later, and the direct disciples. He was one of the first, but he was also highly worldly at the same time, and didn't want to give up his money. And so I just wondering, he is full of shraddha in Sri Ramakrishna, recognizing his divinity, but not particularly much of a yogi in that sense. But what happens? And then do you remember in the gospel, it's actually mentioned in one place where Sri Ramakrishna says, Mothur has had more bhoga left. He had more desire for enjoyment. And so he won't get liberation because he doesn't want it. But he'll come back and he might be reborn as a king or something like that. Do you remember? This is somewhere in the gospel where he mentions that. So this is exactly what this is. It's a nice thing to think about, because in the next verses, Sri Krishna basically explains the fate of somebody who has made some progress on the path of yoga because of that shraddha, that faith in God and Guru and scripture, but who doesn't have enough self-control and who hasn't attained perfection. What happens to that person? This is Sri Krishna's response. So let's take the next three as a chunk, 40 to 42. So let's read them together. So here we go. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha.
Shri Bhagavan Uvacha.
Parthanaiveha.
Parthanaiveha.
Namutra.
Namutra.
Vinashaha.
Vinashaha.
Tasya vidyate.
Tasya vidyate.
Nahi kalyanakarit.
Nahi kalyanakarit.
Kaschit.
Kaschit.
Durgatim.
Durgatim.
Tata gacchati.
Tata gacchati.
41. Prapya.
Prapya.
Punyakatan lokan.
Punyakatan lokan.
ushitva
Ushitva
shashvatihi samaha
Shashvati Samaha
shuchinam
Suchinam
shrimatam gehe
Srimatam Gehe
yoga bhrashtaha
Yoga Brashta
abhijayate
Abhijayate
atha 42 athava
Atava
yoginam eva
Yoginam Eva
kule bhavati
Kule Bhavati
dhimatam
Dhimatam
etad hi
Etadi
durlabhataram
Durlabhataram
loke janma
Loke Janma
yadidrisham.
Yadidrisham.
Very good. You guys are good at chanting, even at this faster pace, so I'm impressed. Thank you. Okay. So, what does Sri Krishna say in response to Arjuna's anxiety and concern? He says, don't you worry at all. There is never destruction, vinasha, either in this world or in the hereafter, for the person who practices good, kalyana krit, the doer of good. Okay, a person who does good things, who engages in spiritual practice, that person will never come to woe, durgatim. Nothing bad will ever happen to that person. So that's verse 40. So then what actually does happen to this person? The next few verses all presuppose the key doctrines of karma and rebirth. And for those of you who watch my talks and stuff, you'll know that and in the book that's coming out soon, Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism, you'll know I distinguish two understandings of the doctrine of karma in Hinduism. Okay, you'll find both within Hinduism. The first is what I call the retributive doctrine of karma, which means it's a kind of reward and punishment model of karma. I do something good, and God rewards me with a lollipop, which means I get good, favorable circumstances, happy circumstances, pleasure in my next life or whatever. I do something bad, God hurts me in some way, slaps me on the wrist or something worse, which means what? I'm born into unfortunate circumstances, I'm genetically predisposed to alcoholism or depression or blah, 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 all sorts of things, like that kind of thing. Now, that is the retributive doctrine of karma. By contrast, a number of modern Hindu thinkers, like, I think, so this is part of my argument, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, and others, Radhakrishna to some extent, defend a different understanding of the Hindu doctrine of karma, which I call the evolutionary doctrine of karma, which is that the overarching purpose of karma is not to reward or punish us, but to foster our spiritual growth. And I think that the Gita can be marshaled as strong evidence in support of the evolutionary doctrine of karma. We're going to get to that soon, but I think one of the best pieces of evidence is verse 45. I mention it in my book, because there's this phrase, aneka janma samsiddhaha. The yogi who in the course of many, many lifetimes, aneka janma, in the course of countless births, finally samsiddha, attains perfection. What does it mean? It means that because of this law of karma and because we keep coming back until we get things right, all of us will eventually attain perfection. And we're with each lifetime, we are evolving. Even when we make mistakes, this is why Swamiji, he says some radical things sometimes. He says, I'm very grateful that I committed sins and that I made mistakes, because each of us learns from our mistakes. Right? Oh, I see, this is what happened as a result of this mistake, and so I won't make it in the future. That's also growth. Which means what? The mistake itself, even though it seems like you might be taking a step back, actually it helps you to take 2 steps. The 1 step back will help you to take 2 or 3 steps forward in the future. So even that wasn't a mistake, and that also helps you on the path. So I think you can develop this kind of, and see this kind of idea, this evolutionary approach to karma and rebirth in the Gita. Okay, so now coming back to verse 41, what exactly happens to this good person who is full of faith but isn't particularly good at yoga and doesn't have all that much self-control? This person, having attained to the world of the righteous, okay, the Sanskrit term is punya katan lokan. It means the temporary heavens you go to if you've accrued a certain amount of good karma, okay? You go up there, you chill and you enjoy. Everything is good there. It's all very positive. There's nothing bad in those places. The only problem is you can't stay there forever. And so once you exhaust your good karma, you have to come back. So svarga, that's the term for heaven, but these are temporary heavens. Okay? And you're there as long as you have good karma. The moment that your balance runs out, you come back to the world, to this earth. And then again, what's the beauty of this world? The beauty of this world is that it's not perfectly good. There's positive and negative, and that's why it's good for our moral and spiritual evolution. That's the idea. If it was just perfectly good, we wouldn't be able to grow. We wouldn't be able to learn. Right? We need pushback from the world, from other people for us to grow. Okay, so that's the idea. That's 41. And then, once that person who dwells in heaven for a certain amount of time, exhausting his or her good karma, comes back to this world in another body, what are the circumstances of that person's birth, that spiritual aspirant's birth? They're born in a household, in a family, which is pure, shuchi, and srimatam. And it could mean wealthy, actually. Prosperous, but glorious is the way that Sri Aurobindo renders it here. There are different ways of understanding it. But full of Shri, that's the term. Shri. Okay? I am reminded of some of the direct disciples, monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, some of the householder disciples. They come from very wealthy families and good families. One of the biggest problems in the U.S. is this problem of broken families, right? Is that kids are raised in households by a single parent, and it can often lead to trauma and other sorts of issues. And so the idea here is, if you're a sincere spiritual aspirant, the circumstances of your next birth will be favorable in a certain way to continue your spiritual journey. Okay, now, verse 42. Otherwise, atava, or, so there's another possibility. So, who is Krishna speaking of? These people who have made a little bit of progress in yoga and who have a lot of faith, but haven't attained perfection. So either you do a lot of good karma, you go to a temporary heaven, enjoy yourself, come back, and you're born into favorable circumstances, continue your spiritual journey. But then among those, there's an even more favorable possibility from a spiritual standpoint, which is that same thing happens, you go up to the temporary heaven, you enjoy up there, you come back, but you're not just born into favorable circumstances in a good household, but you're born in a family of yogis. Your parents themselves are sincere and advanced spiritual aspirants. Good examples from our tradition, Shivanandaji, Mahapurush Maharaj, his father was a tantric adept and attained a certain amount of progress on the path, and may even have attained some kind of realization, to the point where he gave Sri Ramakrishna advice. Shivanandaji's father gave Sri Ramakrishna spiritual advice when Sri Ramakrishna felt a burning sensation all over his body, and he recommended a certain technique. He did it, it worked, and so from that day on, Sri Ramakrishna considered Shivanandaji's father as his guru, one of his gurus, and revered him as such, and therefore didn't let Shivanandaji perform any kind of menial services for him. It's remarkable. So it's quite interesting. That's an example of somebody who was obviously a yogi in his previous birth and then was born into a family of yogis. There are other examples too. I gave a talk recently, short little talk on Ramakrishna Anandaji, but his father was also a tantric adept, a great worshipper of Kali. Okay, so that is verse 42. Now let's read verses 43 to 45. I hope you're not getting dizzy from the pace at which we're going. But 43 to 45, we're reading these as a 3-verse chunk as well. Here we go. 43. Tatratam buddhi sanyogam labate paurvadehikam yatate chatato bhuyah samsiddhau Kurunandana. 44. Purvabhyasena tenaiva hriyate hyavashopisaha jignyasuhu apiyogasya shabda brahma ativartate. 45. Prayatnad yatamanastu yogi samshuddha kilvishaha aneka janma samsiddhaha tato yati parangatim. Very good. So here, now, how does Bhagavan Krishna continue? He's explaining how this yogi who has not quite attained perfection, after coming back and being reborn in another body in favorable circumstances, how does he continue to make spiritual progress? Okay, that's the explanation. So now, verse 43, what happens is, the beauty of it is, whatever we do in this life, gets stored in the form of samskaras, latent mental impressions, in our subtle body. Okay? And then when we leave this body, when we die, what happens? We don't die, the body dies. And we, the eternal soul, the jivatma, in association, we take that subtle body with us. As an eternal soul. It's an eternal soul in association with the subtle body, which has stored up in it all the stuff we did in this life and in past lives. That's the thing that goes up to enjoy in the temporary heaven. That's the entity that comes back and takes on another body in the next life. And because of that, it's like you don't start in your next life with a zero bank balance. You start with what you accrued in your past life. So maybe, 1,000 spiritual dollars, spiritual bucks. And so you start with 1,000. Now, you may not know, this is also a thing, which is that, look, then you might say, well, then why don't we remember what we did in our past lives? Here's the thing. And so it's a little bit more complex than that. The idea is this. God had good reasons for withholding from us exact memories of our past lives. You might ask why. Wouldn't it be fun? No, it's terrifying to know all the crazy stuff we did, terrible stuff. I mean, it can get really weird and harrowing. And, it's enough to know what we did in this life, in our past, let alone knowing what we did in all our past lives. So that's part of the idea of why it's better that most of us not know exactly what we did in our past life. Yet, what is important is there's these sort of, every single one of us, I guarantee you, regardless of whether you're spiritual or not, you're going to feel like nobody is born tabula rasa, like a blank slate, right? We're born, that's why even twins, even identical or fraternal twins may have completely different personalities, right? It's because you're born with different kinds of samskaras, latent mental tendencies, different kind of temperament, right? And so spiritual aspirants, a lot of you might feel like, why is it that I'm drawn to a particular form of God, to a particular spiritual tradition? That's probably because of what you practice in your past birth. That's the basic idea. And so you can still, both these things can be true. The fact that I'm carrying on from where I left off in my past birth, even though I don't know the exact details of what I did. You can kind of reconstruct it based on your temperament, tendencies. When I first started memorizing the Gita, before I joined the order, I was doing my PhD and I started memorizing the Gita. Especially when I got to chapter 3 of the Gita. It was so effortless to memorize it. It was like I didn't even have to look at it. I was like, I must have memorized. I just had this feeling I must have memorized the Gita in a passport, at least chapter 3. Like, I'm not kidding. It was too easy. I was like memorizing 5 verses at a time, like within minutes, and that's just one example. But I think many of you have felt that way in different respects. So anyway, that's the idea behind these. So buddhi sanyogam, that means that you are that person who is born again in another body is endowed with the same subtle body. With the same samskaras, buddhi sanyogam, the buddhi, that's stored up in the buddhi, the samskaras. And so he can pick up where he left off. That's the idea. And then he strives again in the next birth for perfection. Okay, so that's verse 43. And then 44 is just explaining the same idea, and then we get to this very controversial statement in the second line. But first, let's look at the first line. Purvabhyasena, it's because of what he did in his past birth that there's a kind of spiritual momentum that carries him or her forward in the next birth. And it's almost like you feel this momentum. You might not know where it comes from or why, but then that's the reason. And Sri Ramakrishna gives a great example, and Geeta Stevens, online, she's watching, I assume, she mentions this, because one of the study questions was, can you think of any of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings that help illuminate these verses? And so she mentions this, and I thought about the same story. Sri Ramakrishna says, there's this like tantric adept who's in a cremation ground, because that's a typical place where you're supposed to meditate as a tantric, and is deeply immersed in meditation, praying intensely to Mother Kali. What happens? A tiger comes and eats him. And that person doesn't get, obviously misses the goal. There's a person who witnesses, who's just on the side watching this whole scene unfold, and is like, oh my goodness. And then the tiger goes away. So he's like, okay. Looks around and goes, okay, let me sit on that guy's asana. So he goes and sits on that guy's asana. Within minutes, whoosh, Mother reveals herself to him. And now he's wondering, what the heck? This guy spent years, decades of hours a day meditating here, and he's eaten by a tiger. I spend a couple minutes, and Mother, you've revealed yourself to me. What's the deal, man? That seems like pretty partial treatment. That's unbecoming of God. And she goes, you don't know what you did in your past life. You've done so many austerities in your past life, you just don't know. That's what all these verses are about. That's how I see it. Okay. And so that past momentum will carry you forward. Now we get to the second line, and this is where we start opening cans of worms. They're fun cans of worms. It's quite interesting, the questions, and your responses are very thoughtful, and I appreciate it. And this is one of these, this set of study questions, I found the most variation in responses than in any other, as far as I can remember. So, like, because I asked which of the interpretations do you prefer, and so one person, Ramanuja, another one, Śaṅkara, almost nobody says Śaṅkara, but some people say Sri Aurobindo, some people Tapasyananda, and so it's quite interesting, quite helpful to have this discussion. So now, here's the second line. The jigyasu goes beyond Shabda Brahma. The jigyasu goes beyond Shabda Brahma. So there are two Sanskrit terms which are in question. The word jigyasu, which typically means a spiritual seeker, questioner. Because jnāna means knowledge. Jigyasu means seeker of knowledge, seeker of spiritual knowledge. So a sincere spiritual aspirant, that's how I see it. Okay, that complicates the meaning of Shabda Brahman, actually, right? So now, what exactly does Shabda Brahman mean? This is one of our study questions, right? Our first study question, in fact. Now, Sri Aurobindo thinks that Shabda Brahman means the Vedas and the Upanishads. Shabda just means sound or word. Brahman means Brahman, presumably, but we don't know.
Word of God.
Huh?
Word of God.
Word of God is a nice way to think about it. Okay, so Sri Aurobindo takes it very literally and says, Shabda Brahma, Vedas and Upanishads. But then you get this tricky issue of, and he translates it, even the seeker after the knowledge of yoga goes beyond the range of the Vedas and the Upanishads. So, like, it's one thing to say, well, the realized soul. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Ekanka, something along the lines of in Bengali, Ekanka Unubhuti Bed Vedantar Pad, something along those lines, which means the experiences that have happened in this body have gone beyond the Vedas and Vedanta. Okay, that's fine for a vijñāni and Ishvara Koti and God to say. But what about a jigyasu? That's the tricky thing. What does it mean for a sincere spiritual aspirant to go beyond the Vedas and the Upanishads? But Sri Aurobindo bites the bullet on that and says, yeah, it makes sense. And some of you mentioned, I think Patty is one of them online, and some other people mentioned that one of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings is, he says, look, scriptures are like this. Always remember they're a means to an end. You should never treat them as an end in itself. And he gives the example of, you've got a list of ingredients that you need to buy from a grocery store. And you have it with you, then suddenly you lose it. And you're about to go to the grocery store, now you've lost the list. What do? You frantically look around trying to find those ingredients, or the list. And then when you find it, and then you look at it, and then you memorize the ingredients, and then he says you can throw them away. So now, I think this is a good example, because the idea is, this person is not a realized soul yet, right? This person is clearly a jigyasu. Hasn't realized God yet. And it's not that scriptures are useless, but you should know the content of the scriptures, understand them well, don't become obsessive about becoming a pundit and all that. Know what's in it, and then you need to go to work as a spiritual aspirant. That's the crucial thing. An ounce of practice is worth then a pound of theory. I think that's the idea which Ramakrishna would often hammer into the heads of his visitors. And I think that might be a way to understand Sri Aurobindo's understanding of this verse along Ramakrishnan lines. Does that make sense? But there are, of course, divergent interpretations of Shabda Brahman. Śaṅkara, so that's my S with a thing over it, and SW Tap is Swami Tapasyananda. I hope you're getting used to my lingo and lexicon. Okay. Both Śaṅkara and Tapasyananda agree that Shabda Brahman means Vedic ritualism. Okay, it can't mean the scriptures in general, all the scriptures, including the Upanishads, because that's too scandalous. Because the Upanishads are the repository of the highest spiritual wisdom, and how can a mere spiritual aspirant go beyond that? No. Goes beyond the sincere spiritual aspirant who has done enough Vedic ritualism in his or her past birth or in this life can go beyond Vedic ritualism, but now can, according to Śaṅkara, can now move on from the Karma Kanda to the Jnana Kanda, the knowledge portion of the Vedas, which is the Upanishads, and then practice the path of knowledge. And Tapasyananda, of course, was not a strict card-carrying Śaṅkarite, but he still felt that there's this distinction being made in the Gita between ritualist, Vedic ritualists, and then higher spiritual aspects. And I think he has some... So now the interesting thing is, both Sri Aurobindo and Tapasyananda, actually I'm not sure that Tapasyananda does this here explicitly, but Sri Aurobindo definitely, okay? He links this understanding of Shabda Brahman in verse 6.44 with chapter 2, where there's this series of verses in chapter 2. I'll mention the specific ones. Verse 46 of chapter 2 and verses 52 to 53, where Krishna makes some remarkable statements. He says that the realized person doesn't have any need for the Vedas anymore. And so again, traditional commentators will be like, well, it can't mean the Vedas in general. It has to be Vedic ritualism. And there are some verses which specifically attack Vedic fundamentalism. That's true. And so that's the evidence that Tapasyananda and Śaṅkara and others, whoever support this ritualistic reading of Shabda Brahman, they can appeal to those verses in chapter 2 and say, well, look, Krishna even in chapter 2 is criticizing Vedic people who are kind of Vedic ritualistic fundamentalists and think that that's the be-all and the end-all. Just going up to a temporary heaven, enjoying yourself, coming back, and then going up to the heaven again, doing more rituals, going back to heaven. There's a higher spiritual ideal that they're missing. Okay. But Sri Aurobindo says, and this is what's interesting, that in the same chapter 2, if you look at 46, as much use as there is in a well with water and flood on every side, so much is there in all the Vedas for the Brahman who has knowledge. This is not a caste Brahman, but a knower Brahman. The knower of Brahman has as much use for the Vedas as somebody has the use for well water when you're immersed in a giant ocean. And Sri Aurobindo will take that literally and say he means the Vedas in general, not just Vedic ritualism. So his understanding of Shabda Brahman in 6.44 is consistent with his understanding of 2.46 of the Gita. And so I think you can, and I want to leave it open. And as I said, a lot of you in your responses kind of sided with either Sri Aurobindo or Śaṅkara and Tapasyananda. And then there's a third interpretation, just to make things more fun. Ramanuja, that's my R. What does he say? Shabda Brahman is Prakriti, nature. And a lot of you are a little puzzled about what does that mean exactly, and how does that... Now, this is how I understand it, okay? He explains it if you look at the whole commentary on the verse and in the context of the surrounding verses and how he interprets them. The three gunas are part of Prakriti, certainly, but I think it's even more clear and specific, and there's something plausible to it. The idea is the body-mind complex. What side does it fall on? It's part of Prakriti. The body and the mind, both part of Prakriti. And what is the whole purpose of chapter 6, according to Ramanuja? To realize the Jivatman, that we are eternal souls separate from the body-mind complex. And so what he says is, the sincere spiritual aspirant who is sincerely engaged in Karmayoga, selfless action, meditation on the Jivatman, and Bhakti Yoga, but in a lower sense, which means going to Arati and all that stuff, attending lectures at Vedanta study, all that stuff. What happens? They attain Atma Avalokanam. That person realizes that he or she is the Jivatman separate from the body-mind complex. That's what he means by going beyond Prakriti. You break your identification with nature in the form of your own psychophysical complex. That's the idea. And so some of you, I think, I can't remember who, but some of you in your responses like that idea of, Kiran mentioned it, I think that you liked, and some other people also liked that interpretation better than some of the others. So take your pick. I don't want to take a strong stand on that, and you guys should feel free. But Parimal, one of the online respondents, he mentioned that interpretation of Ramanuja and then says, objecting to Ramanuja, he's saying, I think this interpretation of Shabda Brahman as Prakriti is far-fetched because there is a word, jigyasu api, which means even a beginner or casual inquirer into that path of yoga. How can just a beginner reach a high state of realizing himself separate from the body-mind complex? Great question, an interesting objection. Here's how I see it, Parimal and others. Ramanuja, I think, is saying this. Look, the jigyasu here is not just a casual spiritual aspirant by any means. This is somebody who has intense vyakulata, longing. That's the term Ramakrishna used, vyakulata, for God realization. And as a result of that longing and sincere practice, what happens? That person realizes that he is not the body-mind complex, but the eternal Jivatman, separate from the body-mind complex. And now he can set about practicing Bhakti Yoga in earnest, the highest practice of Bhakti Yoga for Ramanuja, which means constantly thinking of God. And then attaining knowledge of Vishnu, of God. So the jigyasu here, as far as I can tell, on Ramanuja's account, is the person who has attained the knowledge of the Jivatman, the individual soul, separate from the body-mind complex, but who has not yet realized God. And so, but is so therefore eligible to practice Bhakti Yoga. And then just immerse him or herself and just think of God at all times, repeat the mantra, and then he realizes God. And so actually in Ramanuja's scheme, I think we can justify it in that way. And then it also makes sense of the structure of the Gita, because look at the verse 47. Ramanuja has a field day with it. Right? The greatest of all yogis, bhakta. Even greater than the yogi who realized the jivatman. That's his reading. Do you see? I mean, it's very clever, actually. Okay. Vikas, I should mention, from London. He gave a very thoughtful response, but he, in the end, he likes all of the interpretations. He says, why do they have to be mutually exclusive? Shabda Brahman itself seems like it's kind of open-ended in being, and so you can interpret it in multiple ways, and whatever helps you, and maybe your interpretation will evolve, but I don't think that we need to be so dogmatic about what it has to mean, so that's also an approach. Now, let us move on to... Well, no, let's discuss 45 very briefly. Okay, Prayatnad, the yogi who is striving, really struggling, working really hard, Prayatnad, yatamanaha, and who is thereby samshuddha kilbishaha, purified from impurities, okay, has attained chitta shuddhi. That's one of the main purposes of spiritual practice, to purify our minds of worldly attachments and worldly desires. What happens? Perfects him or herself through many lifetimes, and then attains the highest goal, the parangatim. Aneka janma samsiddha. That's the phrase I mentioned earlier. Number one, it seems to support this evolutionary approach to the doctrine of karma, the idea that we are on a long spiritual journey in the course of many lifetimes, that with each subsequent birth, we make a little progress in our spiritual journey, our spiritual evolution, ultimately culminating in perfection. And so the thing I want to emphasize now is, this verse can also be marshaled, among other verses in the Gita, to support the doctrine of universal liberation. Now, most traditional commentators, as far as I can tell, I haven't found a single place in any of the traditional commentaries, Ramanuja, Śaṅkara, anywhere, where they explicitly endorse this doctrine of universal liberation. That everybody at the end of the day, at some point, after 5 lifetimes or 1,000,000 lifetimes, will attain liberation. Okay. But many modern thinkers, like Radhakrishnan, like Vivekananda, like Aurobindo, and others, do explicitly uphold this doctrine of universal liberation. Ramakrishna very clearly, he says, everybody will be fed. Some people at 6 in the morning, others at 12 p.m., others at 6 p.m., others at midnight. Those are different number of lifetimes, varying number of lifetimes, but everybody. So a verse like this can help. So if you accept an evolutionary doctrine of karma, and you accept the doctrine of rebirth, then it stands to reason. This is arguably, you're going to get as many chances as it takes to get it right. If you're 99% of the way there, you're going to come back again and finish that 1% that's left. And then you're going to realize, right? Like that dude who came to the cremation ground in a few minutes, got the vision of mother, right? Okay, that's all I want to mention. So now, next chunk, 46 to 47, and we complete the chapter. Look at that. We're making good progress here. Tapasvibhyo adhiko yogi jnanibhyaha api mataha adhikaha. Okay, the sandhi makes it a little bit hard to read. Okay, karmibhyaha chadhiko yogi tasmad yogi bhava Arjuna. Next verse, 47. Yoginam api sarvesham madgatena antaratmana. Madgatena antaratmana shraddhavan bhajate yomam same yuktatamo mataha. All right, now I get to more fun verses. 46. There seems to be a kind of hierarchy. Now, let's not get it twisted and think that this is like a U.S. News 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not quite like that. It's one and everybody else. So it's 46, if we just look at 46 now. So what he's saying is, yogis, I'm just using the Sanskrit terms here, are greater than X, Y, and Z. Tapasvis, karmis, and jnanis. These are the terms used. Yogis are greater than tapasvis, who are practitioners of austerity. Yogis are greater than the karmis, engagers in people, those who engage in action or karma yoga, unclear. I mean, it just says karmi, which means engagers in karma, people who engage in karma. And then jnanis. These terms are open-ended and they're ambiguous, right? So Yogis are greater than jnanis. Big problem for Śaṅkara, as Tapasyananda points out. Okay. Depending on how we interpret jnani, right? And so it's a problem for a lot of people. I mean, it's tricky to understand. So jnani seems to mean literally prima facie. It means it's just a knower, like a realized soul, but it may have to be interpreted differently. Yogis are greater than tapasvis, karmis, and jnanis. The two terms that are really kind of tricky for commentators are yogi. What exactly is this yogi in this verse? And what exactly do we mean by jnani here? Okay. Now, Śaṅkara. Let's start with Śaṅkara. Because remember, for him, the highest goal is knowledge of non-dual Brahman through the practice of the path of knowledge, right? So here, he takes yogi to mean a realized soul, a knower of Brahman. In 46, keep that in mind. Now, we'll see how his view suddenly changes in 47. But in 46, this is understanding of yogi, okay? So the yogi, the one who has realized non-dual Brahman, is greater than everybody, of course. That's kind of stands to reason. But then, what does he do with jnani? He treats jnani to mean mere pandit. Somebody who has intellectual understanding of the scriptures, but who has not realized. Okay, this is a classic trick he uses. We're going to find that again when we discuss the terms jnana and vijñāna in chapter 7 in the beginning of the Gita, where Śaṅkara will say, so jnana there means just mere punditry, intellectual knowledge of scriptures. Vijñāna means realization of the non-dual self. Where Sri Aurobindo interprets these terms in more of a Ramakrishna way, we'll see that later. That's to come. But Tapasyananda again is in agreement with Śaṅkara. So he doesn't always agree with Śaṅkara, but here again he agrees, jnani can't mean the full-blown realized soul who's realized Brahman, because then the yogi can't be greater than the jnani. So the jnani has to be a mere pandit. So he says a mere scholar. That's Tapasyananda. Okay. Now, I personally feel that Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of this verse is a little bit ambiguous. You can just look at it. This is page 246 of Essays on the Gita. And let me read you. This is the last paragraph of the chapter. Let me read to the whole paragraph because it also covers 6.47. It addresses Gitan's question from a few weeks ago about the highest secret or whatever. Okay. Page 246. The Gita brings in here, as always, bhakti as the climax of the yoga. Sarva bhuta stitam yo mam bhajati ekatvamasitaha. Actually, that's a quote from 6.31, but he's bringing it in here. That may almost be said to sum up the whole final result of the Gita's teaching. Whoever loves God in all and his soul is founded upon the divine oneness. However he lives and acts in God. This is very much like Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva, those who see the divine in others and serves them accordingly. And to emphasize it still more, after an intervention of Arjuna in a reply to his doubt as to how so difficult a yoga can be at all possible for the restless mind of man, the divine teacher returns to this idea and makes it his culminating utterance. Pause quickly here. Strikingly, you don't find individual commentaries from Sri Aurobindo's Essay on the Gita on most of these verses, the ones that I just went through. It's interesting. He doesn't even translate them really. He just sums up the whole thing like a bunch of verses in this way. And then he moves on to the ones that he thinks are most important, 46 and 47. He goes, quote, the yogin is greater than the doers of ascesis, tapasvis, greater than the men of knowledge, jnanis. Men of knowledge, what exactly does he mean by that? We can push it.
Intellectual.
Is it intellectual knowers of scripture, or is it the
Scriptural knowledge.
yeah, maybe. Okay, but no, I don't think it's obvious. Greater than the men of works. Men of works, does he mean karma yogi or Vedic ritualists? I think maybe karma yogi is my guess. Become then the yogin, O Arjuna. Become a yogi. The yogin, one who seeks for and attains, note, by works, karma yoga, and knowledge, jnana yoga, and ascesis, tapasya, austerities, or by whatever other means. So by any yoga. Now listen carefully, because a lot of you, I think, or some of you missed this. He says, not even spiritual. So let me read again. The yogin, one who seeks for and attains by works and knowledge and ascesis, or by whatever other means, not even spiritual knowledge, or power, or anything else for their own sake. I think that's really important. For their own sake. But the union with God alone. For in that all else is contained, and in that lifted beyond itself to a divinest significance. So here's how I take Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of 6.46. I see him as saying, look, tapasvis, people who engage in a lot of austerity, but for a siddhi, for instance. like a supernormal power, being able to read other people's thoughts, being able to walk on water, being able to know what's going on in another country. Swedenborg, by the way, Emanuel Swedenborg, this Swiss mystic, he claimed to have this ability. He recognized that there was a fire somewhere where, this is way before telephones and stuff and newspapers. So, okay, so that's Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. Or karmis, people who you can engage in a spiritual practice, but with a worldly aim. It could be cure my son or cure myself of cancer, or I want more money, I want a promotion, or I want supernormal powers, right? All those things are possible. You can engage in bhakti for that reason. You can. So what Sri Aurobindo is saying is, the greater person, the greater spiritual aspirant, is the one who engages in the same kind of yoga, but with a purely spiritual aim. What is that purely spiritual aim? Union with the divine. I want nothing but union with the divine. That's why Sri Ramakrishna would often say in the gospel, how should we pray to God and what should we ask for? I don't want any bodily pleasures. I don't want name and fame. I don't want the 8 occult powers, the 8 supernormal powers. I want nothing but Shuddha Bhakti, pure love for your lotus feet, O Lord. This is Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, as far as I can tell. It's actually very much in line with Ramakrishna here. But then you might ask, well, then how does he get to 6.47 and how does he interpret that in relation? Because he's already building in bhakti into 46, right? Seems to be. So now, how does he do it? I thought we figured this out. Okay, hold on. But before we get to 647, okay, but 46. Let me explain some of the other interpretations. Swami Tapasyananda takes yogi here to mean a man of meditation. Not necessarily a man, a person of meditation. So a meditator. That's yogi. And a meditator is better than all these dudes who are doing some spiritual practices, but who don't have concentrated minds, basically. Okay. And then Tapasyananda can easily interpret 47 to mean, well, even among the meditators, the one who meditates on God is the best among yogis. This is the way that Tapasyananda interprets 46 in relation to 47. Okay. Now, Ramanuja, as I already said, he takes yogi here to mean one who has realized the Jivatman, separate from the body-mind complex. And he's greater than all these because they haven't realized the Jivatman yet. They're still identified with the body-mind complex. They're still mistakenly identifying with the body-mind complex. So he's more spiritually advanced. Because why? Because now he's eligible to practice bhakti yoga. And now he can just immerse himself in God, think of God at all times, and then realize the highest goal, which is even beyond the realization of the Jivatman, which is mentioned in 47. So why is the bhakta the greatest among all the yogis? Because realization of the Jivatman doesn't give you liberation. Even that doesn't give you liberation. What you need for liberation is to realize Vishnu, the personal God. When you've done that, you've achieved the highest. And then after you leave the physical body, you dwell in not a temporary heaven, but an eternal heaven. Vishnu Loka. With your beloved Vishnu, you lovingly serve and commune with him. So that's how Ramanuja makes sense of 46 and 47. Now, Sri Aurobindo. Let me see. Let me talk about Śaṅkara first, quickly. Now, Śaṅkara with 46, he takes yogi, remember, to mean the knower of non-dual Brahman, so the full realized soul, okay? Which means jnani is a mere pandit. So that you can, now, how plausible that is, another question, and you can argue against that, you might not find. Now, but even trickier, how does he connect that with 47? Which seems to be just prima facie praising bhakti above everyone else, even among all the yogis. As far as I can tell, I've read his commentary fairly carefully, and what I see him doing is, he's not actually seeing 47 as continuing directly from 46. So, prima facie, literally, if we take 47 to follow from 46, we see this. Yogis are greater than all these, XYZ, tapasvis, karmis, and jnanis. And then 47, following up on that, says, but even among those yogis who are better than those three, bhaktas are the greatest yogi, right? That's how I think what Śaṅkara is doing is he's saying that 46, let's leave it alone. Now when we get to 47, Krishna is changing the topic. I'm serious. And then he says, 47, yogi nama sarvasham, among all the yogis, and here he says yogi is not referring to the yogis in 46. Yogis are worshippers of any kind, of all kinds, worshippers of all kinds. And he says among those worshippers of Krishna are greater than worshippers of minor deities, devatas, Agni and there's other kinds of... So it's like this 47 is almost like a kind of non sequitur. He does this actually in his interpretation of the Isha Upanishad because it gets really tricky. And so he'll suddenly say that the Upanishad changes gears suddenly. And it's like, oh, now he's addressing a different spiritual aspect. So that's kind of what I think that's part of the reason why Swamiji says that Śaṅkara and other traditional commentators sometimes tortured the scriptures. So I think it's the better interpretation of 46 and 47 has to see them as of a piece. And sees the yogī-naṁ, the yogis mentioned in 47, as referring to a subset of the yogis mentioned in 46. I think that's the more plausible interpretation. So now, I think Sri Aurobindo is trying to do that. Now, how exactly he does it is a little bit ambiguous, as I said. Let me continue reading. So he says, this is page 246 of Vedanta Gita. He says, okay, but the union with God alone. So now he's done explaining 46. For in that, all else is contained, and in that lifted beyond itself to a divinest significance. But even among yogins, the greatest is the bhakta. Quote, of all yogins, he who with all his inner self given up to me, for me has love and faith, shraddhavan bhajate, him I hold to be the most united with me in yoga. It is this that is the closing word of these first 6 chapters, and contains in itself the seed of the rest, of that which still remains unspoken, and is nowhere entirely spoken. For it is always and remains something of a mystery and a secret, rahasyam, the highest spiritual mystery and the divine secret. And Kiran, a long time ago, she asked, referring to this last sentence, she says, like, what exactly is this big secret? And why make such a big deal out of this? And what's going on here? Sri Aurobindo, there's definitely a kind of like a narrative suspense in his commentary on the Gita here, and he's like, it's kind of fun. And so he's kind of saying like, wait for it, and then when does it come? Chapter 15, as far as I can tell. Chapter 15 is what all of these chapters are moving toward. Chapter 15. It's all about the Purushottama, baby. It's all about the Benjamins, baby. You know, that as an old Puff Daddy. We can't talk about Puff Daddy anymore. Cancelled, like Bill Cosby. So anyway, but I'm referring to it because it's still a good song. It's still a good song. We can separate the man from his craft. Okay, so... okay, so anyway, it's not spiritual life. You can be a great scientist and be a bad person. You can be a great artist and be a bad person. Okay. I don't want to get canceled. Maybe I do. I don't know. Maybe I'm asking for it. I don't know. Anyway, all right. Anyway, it's all about the Purushottama, baby. That is the point. That is like if you wanted to distill the Sri Aurobindo Vedanta Gita in one sentence, that's it. It's all about the Purushottama, baby.
So
yeah.
We're still on the ladder at 647 is the point.
We are.
So there is no really figuring out, none of the answers are complete or full. They're just the point in time.
I think what Sri Aurobindo is saying here is, up to chapter 6, there is no mention of the Purushottama, no explicit mention of the Purushottama, and yet there are little hints, again and again, little bursts of bhakti, little outbursts of bhakti. Matparaha is the first little phrase in chapter 2. Be intent on me. Who is the me? Purushottama, but secret. Okay. 3. Mai sarvani karmani sanyasya. Dedicate all your actions to me, O Arjuna. Who is that me? Purushottama, but not explicitly mentioned. And then chapter 6, last verse. After all this talk of the impersonal Atman and this and that, suddenly, among all the great meditators, the greatest is the one who worships me. Who is that me? Doesn't come until chapter 15. Who is the me? This is the big mystery. And even in chapter 15, I think Sri Aurobindo says, it's not fully revealed, because I think the full revelation comes with spiritual experience, which Arjuna gets in chapter 11, and it's so terrifying and so breathtaking that he's like, okay, enough. Like Hridaya gets crazy when Sri Ramakrishna touches him and gives him that experience. It's too much, because he's not spiritually ready for it. So maybe that's part of what he's saying there. Okay, now, how does Sri Aurobindo understand 47 in relation to 46? This is how I see it, in light of this paragraph. Aurobindo says, the yogis in 46 are those who seek union with the divine alone by any means. Notice he says, by works and knowledge and ascesis, or by whatever other means. But notice he's not mentioning bhakti in his commentary on 46. Among those yogis who are all very, very sincere and who desire union with the divine alone, those who make their primary spiritual practice bhakti, the nucleus of their spiritual life, around which karma and austerity and jnana yoga and all the others can float around like electrons and protons. So it's not that you're just an exclusive bhakta, but that you're doing all the yogas. But that the person, that yogi who makes bhakti yoga central to his or her practice is greater than all the other yogis. Why? We get the real, like the full answer only in chapter 18 as far as I can tell. Sarva dharman parityajya. Abandoning all other dharmas. Worship me alone and take refuge in me, says Krishna. At the very, very end, at the climax of the entire Gita. Right? Why? Because if you take refuge in God, God will take care of, you don't have to, He'll take care of 90% of it. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, you take one step toward God, God will take 10 steps toward you. Whereas this other stuff is all like self-effort based paradigms. The baby monkey. We're all baby monkeys. I have to do this much japa, and nowadays we use the electronic counter, and I have to do this many, literally this 10,000 repetition, and then I've got to do this much, and then I have to renounce everything all at once and be a hero, and then what I think the Gita is saying, this is the highest spiritual state is being the baby kitten. Is saying I can't do this on my own, and not just that. Why should I even try to do it on my own? When there's an infinite, omnipotent, divine, perfectly loving being who's waiting to help me and support me. If I only take refuge and surrender. All I need to do is surrender. Of course, surrender is the hardest thing in the world. But that's it. And so the main spiritual practice becomes one of surrendering. And we're all in the situation of that bird on the mast. Getting bored suddenly. We're like, oh, okay, so you start flying in one direction. And you're looking and looking, but you see nothing but the vast expanse. Nowhere to land. And then you freak out and you say, oh, I have to rush back, and you barely make it back to the mast. And you sit there, okay, fine. But then again, after a few days, okay, let me go to the east, because I didn't go to the east yet, so let me go to the east. All of these are like, I'm going in one direction, tapasya, and then come back, and okay. And then, well, let me try Karmayoga. But again, more self-effort oriented Karmayoga. Okay, and then I come back. And then I do the jnana yoga, and then I come back. And then finally, it's like, you know what? Sitting still here as a bhakta, better than anything else. Better than anything else. Girish Ghosh. We should all be Girish Ghosh in the end. Don't go to brothels. Speaking of Puff Daddy. Anyway. See that? That's called a callback. Callback, baby. I know you appreciate that. All right. So okay. So now, I want to address some of your questions because let's see here. Oh, and the other difference. So you might ask, well, what's the difference between Ramanuja's interpretation of these verses and Sri Aurobindo's? The difference is, as far as I can tell, the main one. There are multiple, but the main one is they interpret 47 along the same lines. Bhakti is the greatest. Great. But bhakti toward whom? Ramanuja says toward Vishnu, personal God. Sri Aurobindo, Purushottama. That's why this is such a high secret, because it's not mentioned in the traditional commentaries that it's really the impersonal, personal Purushottama, where the impersonal non-dual Brahman and the personal God are placed on an equal footing. Like Sri Ramakrishna used to say, Brahman and Shakti are non-different, right? Because even the Vaishnava school, even though they accept that Krishna also has an impersonal aspect, it's always at a lower level. It's just, Brahman is just the peripheral brilliance, the Tanubha of Krishna. But to see the realization of the non-dual Brahman as equally valuable as the realization of the personal God, and seeing them as non-different in a radical sense, that's something that the Gita introduces explicitly in chapter 15. And this is also, I think, at the heart of our own tradition, the Ramakrishna spiritual tradition. And when we're given mantra diksha and we're told to meditate on Sri Ramakrishna and take Ramakrishna's name, I think the best way to think of Sri Ramakrishna is as the Purushottama. And some of your gurus, depending on who your guru is, they might break down the mantra in that way, that the different aspects of the mantra correspond to the different aspects of the impersonal, personal, infinite Purushottama. There's a kind of impersonal aspect, there's the Shakti aspect, there's the, you know what I mean? And there's also God manifesting as the world aspect. So it's very beautiful. You can think about it that way. And then your whole spiritual practice becomes so much richer, and and who is Sri Ramakrishna? He becomes vaster and vaster. And all you have to do is surrender to him. Okay. Now I want to get to some questions here. It's 10:32. I know, I'm aware, but it's just, let's see here. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Now, Parimal. He has two questions. I don't know if I can read both, but let's see. In verse 25, Bhagavan says, do not think of anything. Remember, this is chapter 6 to 25. Don't think of anything. Nakinchada vichinte. Don't think of anything at all. And he says, verse 47, last verse, give up your inner self to me with love and faith. So think of Krishna, which can mean think of me. Is it not a paradox, or does it not seem like a contradiction? So what does it mean? Again, Ramanuja will say, well, that's because it's explaining different stages in spiritual progress. all along up to 47, so up to 46 actually I should say, what's being taught is realize the Jivatman, realize the Jivatman, realize the Jivatman. So don't think of anything but the Jivatman. But then that also, so Ramanuja has to be creative in interpreting don't think of anything. Because literally it's saying don't think of anything at all. So even the Jivatman could be one interpretation. It gets tricky actually. Maybe it's suggesting some kind of radical, almost Buddhist kind of meditative practice of literally thinking of nothing at all. Make the mind a complete blank. Or Yoga Sutras kind of seems to teach that sometimes. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, complete cessation of all mental modifications whatsoever as the highest goal. Like make the mind a complete blank. That gets tricky. But if you take it to mean that chapter 6 is meant to teach you meditate on the non-dual self, then there's no problem, because think of me is meditate on the Purushottama, for whom the impersonal self is the impersonal aspect, the static aspect. So it's like a different object of meditation. All along it's been meditate on the non-dual self. Now it's meditate on the Purushottama through bhakti. Okay. Paddy, I'm having a hard time understanding who Krishna is talking about in verses 40 to 44. That's his direct answer to Arjuna's question about the person who doesn't attain the heights of yoga, the perfection of yoga. She says, who is this yogi? Is this person a jnāna yogi, someone who has followed Patanjali's yoga? What is the righteous world that this yogi has experienced from which he has fallen? Also, how does this tie to verse 2.40? It's just somebody, anybody who has made some. I think we can broaden this, and I think Sri Aurobindo also broadens it. It's not just a follower of any specific path, but any sincere spiritual aspirant who has made some progress along the path of yoga, any yoga, bhakti yoga, karma yoga, and has faith in the scriptures, in the guru, in God, but has not attained the highest goal of spiritual perfection, of liberation. What happens to that person? And he's explaining it. So I think it's important not to be narrow here and think that this is a specific practitioner of the Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali. I think it's much broader than that. That's how I see it. I'll try to address one more question here. Shatuk, I think is relatively new. Maybe this is the first time he's answered questions from Kolkata. He says, Maharaj, thank you for the whole thing. I've never known any Gita class like this. Thank you. Not that I've attended many others, but from what little I have, this is the best. Okay, is that a backhanded compliment? Anyway, okay. My question is, now that we are about to finish chapter 6, what would you say about 6.3 and 6.7? Even though I agree with you about Vijñāna Vedanta, I think Śaṅkara's take on 6.3 is quite plausible. It may not be an instance of text torturing. Okay, to remind us, all of us, about what 6.3 is, this Arurukshormone Yogam. This is that one of those verses that like Śaṅkara has a field day with, because he kind of built it in the framework of his entire interpretation of the whole Gita. Because remember, it says basically, if you take it literally, those who are trying to ascend the hill of yoga, karma is the cause. And those who have reached the top of this hill of yoga, shama is the cause, is the main thing. And shama is quiescence, it seems to mean. It could mean like ceasing from action. And so, of course, Śaṅkara will say, that's why Karmayoga is for inferior spiritual aspirants. And then shama, quietism, is for higher spiritual aspirants. And in fact, Shatuk, who is Bengali, clearly, because he starts quoting Bengali teachings of Sri Ramakrishna here and says, doesn't Sri Ramakrishna seem to say the same thing sometimes? Doesn't he say the pregnant woman who, the more pregnant she gets, like as you know, the further along in the stage of pregnancy she becomes, the less work she's able to do, until what happens? Gives birth to the baby, mother-in-law says, now you're bedridden. You're not doing anything, I'll take care of everything. That's God, right? So the mother-in-law is like God there. So God will take up the burden. And Sri Ramakrishna, it's true, and other people like Gita mentioned this too, is that like at a certain point in a spiritual practice, Sri Ramakrishna couldn't do the Vedic rituals anymore. The water would dribble up, down through his fingers. He couldn't cup the water in his hands. And so this is tricky, and I don't want to give any pat answer to this. I think that you find in the Gita many different teachings for different kinds of spiritual aspirant, and for a certain kind of spiritual aspirant, they might find that at a certain stage in spiritual progress, quiescence, quietism, refraining from really externalized worldly activities might be helpful to them. Why do you think some of us become monks? I'm still teaching you guys, and I'm still going on hikes and this and that, but still, monks are not quite as engaged in the world as other people, non-monastics. And then they're among the yogis. So among the monks, there are some who dwell in caves, and who do absolutely nothing other than eat food which are donated to them or that they get through begging, and then focus on meditation. So that's another type, right? So Sri Aurobindo is an interesting case, and I'm talking about this toward the end of my chapter, the first chapter of my book, because Sri Aurobindo, I don't want to open the can of worms again, so I'm afraid, but I'm just going to say it and then run away. Sri Aurobindo faults Ramakrishna, interestingly and ironically, for basically he's saying well, Sri Ramakrishna was in seclusion for a lot of his life, and then when he actually started interacting with devotees toward the end of his life, he ended up getting throat cancer and then died. And he says, I don't think this is an ideal way of engaging with the world, is what he says. Fascinatingly and interestingly, I don't know how much you know about the life of Aurobindo, and the people who are real hardcore Aurobindonians might really freak out about this. But anyway, this is what I'm trying to develop in my chapter. He's 1926. He has this experience that he calls the descent of the overmind into earth consciousness. 1926. What happens after that? He retreats into extreme seclusion. Extreme seclusion. He's in a room. He doesn't meet the greatest luminaries of his day. Gandhiji wants to meet him. Nope, sorry, tough luck. And all these people are dying. The remaining 24 years of his life until he leaves his body in 1926 to 1950, he's in his room. And this is the person who poked Śaṅkara for encouraging inaction. Not that he was inactive, so he maintained an active epistolary correspondence. So constantly writing. So I'm not saying he was lazy or that, it's not that. But he was completely isolated from society. And I think that's the very thing he's faulting Sri Ramakrishna for, even though Sri Ramakrishna was married. He was a priest in a temple. He was constantly interacting with devotees in a way that Aurobindo didn't fail to do for the remaining 24 years of his life. So this is a weird, I find this strange, and I've asked some Aurobindonians about this, and I haven't gotten a satisfactory answer. For those of you out there who want to defend Aurobindo on this, I'd love to hear it. And then he even says, God laughed at Śaṅkara 3 times. And one of those times was when Śaṅkara stormed about India preaching inaction. That was another time was when he wrote the Ishopanishad commentary, because Sri Aurobindo found it to be a howler. Just really text torturing and all that. But this one is funny, is that Śaṅkara is teaching that at some point in spiritual progress you have to give up action and then focus on the path of knowledge. And Śaṅkara himself did the opposite. He's running around debating with people, starting mattas, worshipping all sorts of stuff. And he's saying, look at that. And now Sri Aurobindo, the great preacher of activity and engagement in the world and dynamism, retreats into seclusion for the last 24 years of his life. Meditate on that. Thank you, everyone. See you when I come back from South Africa. Yes, Anthony.
Since you're online, correct the record. Swedenborg was Swedish, not Swiss.
Thank you. What did I say? Swiss.
You said Swiss.
I always confuse those things. Yes, thank you. That's why I hesitated. Thank you. Emmanuel Swedenborg was Swedish, not Swiss. Yeah. Not from Switzerland, but from Sweden. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. That was fun. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. We finished 10 verses in one class.
Good job.